If you would, open your Bibles with me to Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, chapter 9. We're going to continue on. Chapter 9, part B. Last week we looked at the Apostle Paul's testimony of how he served and shared the gospel, proclaimed the message of Christ. And he didn't do it for money. He said, I'm not doing it for money. He said, I could. I have the privilege to receive compensation. He said, but I'm not. Now, Paul did get gifts. Paul wrote the Philippians, and he said, I thank you for the gift that you sent me. But Paul didn't want to be a hindrance. He didn't want to be one. In fact, he had wrote in other places that some preach the gospel in order to get money or out of pride or just in spite of Paul. Paul was in jail, and he said, they're sharing the gospel. They're bringing the message. He said, but I'm not really down because the gospel is going out. We've seen over the past years, over the past decades even, and even the past centuries, how preachers, how Christians who've been effective in sharing the gospel, winning people to Jesus, preaching his word, have stumbled, have fallen, and sin is uncovered. And some would say, well, that's a way to denigrate the gospel of Christ. But in fact, it shows the power of the gospel even through sinful people. So Paul, beginning in verse 15, I invite you to join with me there. Paul says, for my part, I have used none of these rights. Paul said, I had the right to, but I didn't. Nor have I written these things that they may be applied in my case. For it would be better for me to die than for anyone to deprive me of my boast. For if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast, because I am compelled to preach. And woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if unwillingly, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? To preach the gospel and offer it free of charge, and not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. We're going to continue on a little bit later, but I want us to think a little bit as we begin this morning about the privilege of sharing the gospel. You know, some would think, and you look at this and you're a Christian, a layman, or a laywoman, or not a called minister of the gospel, but in fact, we're all called. We're all commissioned. We're all commanded to share the love of Jesus. We're all commanded, commissioned, and compelled to tell people about Jesus. We look at our world going around and we have coronavirus, but long before that, we had cancer. Imagine someone, a doctor, who invented a cure for cancer, who said, I'm just going to keep it to myself. Some people might not want to hear what I have to say. Some people might not want to know about this cure. If they want to know, they can ask me. We would think they were terrible. We would think they were evil, perhaps, to hold back a cure for a deadly, dreaded disease. But I tell you, it's a privilege to share the gospel. Some of y'all remember Audrey Reeves, little Audrey. She was small and she was sweet and she was fired up, and I'd go visit her and she'd say, oh, Brother Tim, she said, I love telling people about Jesus because of what Jesus brought to her. She was married when she first heard the gospel. She was stationed at an Air Force base with her husband. And she said, somebody came and told me about Jesus. And I thought that was the best thing in the world. She said, I've always loved to tell people about Jesus. You might not have known that. So many of God's choicest servants aren't on TV. They aren't streaming live right now like we're trying to do. We got some folks tuning in. Thank you for looking in. Apologize for the slowness of our internet, but that's going to be happening. A lot of God's choicest servants are just ordinary people sharing an extraordinary gospel. So it is a privilege. We have a privilege, and Paul talked about this privilege that he had. He didn't want anything to take away from his boast in being able to share the gospel free of charge. In this text, we see three things that kind of jumped out at me. That, first of all, is that God uses humble servants. God uses humble servants. He doesn't use the proud. He doesn't use the flashy. Now, he can, but only by the power of the Word and the Spirit. God does. There are some fat, flashy preachers around. I'm not one of them, in case you didn't know. But there are some silver tongue. I think about Adrian Rogers. Now, you talk about somebody who could have been prideful. But Adrian Rogers, what a voice, what the way he structured his messages. It was just phenomenal. Great preacher, but a humble servant. Look at verse 19. We've kind of jumped ahead a little bit. Paul said, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. Paul said, hey, I'm not a slave. He said, I could be a superstar. Think about it. Think about Paul's pedigree. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, trained by Gamaliel. He was a persecutor of the church, and then he had the Damascus Road experience, saw Jesus face to face. Paul could have shoveled it in their face all the time. He could have had a booking agent to book him at the biggest jails in the Roman world. He could have done that, but he didn't.